Hello, listeners. If you can hear and see this, it means you're breathing and you're alive. Well done. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. The thing they don't tell you about working in a place like this is the silence. Not the kind of quiet you get in a library, but a heavy, swallowing silence that seems to press in from the concrete walls. It's a silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud, that makes the click of your security badge in the reader echo like a gunshot. I work beneath level 5, which itself is buried so deep that thinking about the weight of the earth above you is a quick way to trigger a panic attack. My official title is Archival Logistics Coordinator, which is a fancy way of saying I move boxes from one room to another and log their identification codes into a system that hasn't been updated since before I was born. The boxes aren't interesting. They're dull gray metal with serial numbers stamped on the side. No labels, no hints. The rules are what's interesting. They gave them to me on my first day, a single laminated sheet of paper, and the man who handed it to me, a tired-looking guy with eyes that never quite met mine, told me to memorize them, then to eat the paper. I'm not joking. I had to chew and swallow that laminated sheet. It tasted like plastic and chemical lemon. The rules are now a part of me in the most literal sense, and I think about them with every step I take down here. Rule 1 is the first and last thing you do every shift is count the overhead lights in your assigned sector. The number must always be 37. If you count 36, you are to immediately cease all movement, close your eyes, and recite the preamble to the Constitution backwards until you hear 3 consecutive clearance badge swipes. If you count 38, you are to proceed directly to the sector's washroom, turn on the cold tap in the 3rd sink, and place your left hand under the water until the feeling returns to your fingertips. I have never counted 36 or 38. I have always counted 37, but my coworker Jerry, who worked Sector 7 Gamma, he counted 36 once. He told me about it in the cafeteria, his voice a low monotone. He said he stood there for 45 minutes reciting backwards gibberish until the badge is swiped. He said the air got cold, so cold he could see his breath, in a place where the climate control never wavers. And he said he heard whispering, not from any direction, but from inside his own head, telling him to open his eyes, that it was okay. He didn't, and when the security team came to get him, he was crying. He was transferred out the next day. I never saw him again. Rule 2 involves the doors. All of them are heavy, soundproofed, with electronic locks. The rule states that if any door is already slightly ajar when you approach, you must not open it further or look through the gap. You must stand exactly 1 meter back and announce your presence and intent. For example, I would say, "This is Archival Coordinator for Sector 9 Epsilon. I am entering to retrieve container designations." You wait for a full minute of silence. If you hear anything in response, even a sigh, you leave and report the door as compromised. If you hear nothing, you may push the door open with your foot without looking at the hinge side. I have only encountered an ajar door once. It was the door to the long-term storage hallway, a place I go twice a week. I did as I was told, my voice shaking as I spoke to the dark gap. I waited. The silence felt thicker than usual. At the 50-second mark, I heard a sound, like dry leaves skittering across concrete. It came from inside the room. I turned and walked away. My report was logged and dismissed with a code I didn't recognize. The next day, the door was sealed shut with a welded metal plate. My access route was changed. Rule 3 is about the elevators. We don't use the main ones. We have a separate freight system. The rule says you must never, under any circumstances, ride the elevator alone. You must always have a container with you. An empty one is acceptable. But a person is not a valid substitute. The manual says this is a weight distribution safety protocol. I know that's a lie, because one time the power flickered, and I was trapped between levels with a container of what felt like nothing. It was light as a feather. The lights went out, and the emergency battery strips along the floor glowed a faint green. In that green gloom, I felt the container vibrate. A gentle, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. Then I heard a scratching from inside, not frantic, but deliberate, like something was trying to trace a pattern on the inner metal. I held perfectly still until the power returned. When I delivered the container, its serial number was redacted on my manifest, just a black bar of ink. The days blend together down here, a cycle of counting lights, moving boxes, and following rules that make less sense the more you think about them. There's a rule about the coffee machine. If it dispenses a liquid that is any color other than black or a smell that is not coffee, you are to pour it into the special waste bin lined with a biohazard bag and report the machine's location and time of occurrence. There's a rule about shadows. Your own shadow should always match your movements precisely. If it lags or moves independently, you are to find the nearest source of bright, direct light and stand in it until your shadow reintegrates. I laughed at that one when I read it. I'm not laughing anymore. The most troubling rules are the ones about other people. Rule 8 states that you will recognize your assigned coworkers by their faces and their badge photos. If a coworker's face seems blurred, unfamiliar, or too perfect, you are not to acknowledge them. You are to avoid direct eye contact and complete your tasks as if alone. If they speak to you, you may respond only with the following phrase: "My authorization is currently pending. Please direct inquiries to the shift supervisor." I've only had to use that once. It was with a woman from the logistics wing. I'd seen her 100 times. But that day her features seemed smeared like a wet painting. Her smile was static, never changing, as she asked me about a missing shipment. My mouth was dry as I recited the phrase. She just stood there, smiling, for what felt like an hour. Then she turned and walked away, not down the hallway, but into a solid wall. She didn't vanish. She just sort of melted into it. The wall rippled like water and then was concrete again. I didn't report that. Some things you just know better than to put into a report. It was about 6 months in when I first encountered the thing with the stairs. We have emergency stairwells, sealed behind blast doors and never used. The rule is simple. You never use the stairs. The elevators are your only vertical transit. If the elevators are non-functional, you are to remain in place and await extraction. One night, during a mandatory overtime shift, the elevator system went down for maintenance, a rare but scheduled event. We were told to hold in our sectors. I was in the middle of a long inventory log. The silence was heavier than usual. That's when I heard it. A distant, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from behind the stairwell door at the end of the hall. It wasn't frantic. It was patient. A steady beat like a slow heart or a mallet on wood. And with it, a sound like someone dragging a heavy sack up the steps. One drag, one thump. One drag, one thump. I sat at my desk, my hand frozen over the keyboard. The rule said to stay put, but another rule, a deeper one written in my own fear, told me to look. I didn't approach, but I stared at that door, and as I watched, the heavy-duty lock on it, a solid steel bolt, began to turn, not breaking, just turning. As if an invisible hand was trying the mechanism, it turned once, clicked, turned again, clicked. It did this for the entire 2 hours the elevators were down. The dragging and thumping never got closer, never got further. It just persisted. When the elevator pinged back to life, the sound stopped, and the lock snapped back to its original position with a final, deafening clunk. You live with this, you normalize it. The strange rules become just another part of the job. Like filling out a timesheet. You joke about it in the cafeteria, but the jokes are hollow and die quickly. We all have the same look in our eyes, a kind of weary vigilance. We're paid obscenely well, and the benefits are enough to make you sign your life away, which is essentially what we've done. My theory, the one we all share but never say aloud, is that we're not here to guard secrets from the outside world. We're here to guard the outside world from the secrets. And the rules are the bars on a very deep, very dark cage. The change started subtly. It was the containers first. The ones I was supposed to move began to feel warm, not hot, just a few degrees above ambient, like something alive had been resting against them. Then the manifests started glitching. I'd scan a code and the screen would show not a serial number, but a string of symbols that looked like musical notation mixed with mathematical equations. The screen would then flash and correct itself. My supervisor would call it a system ghost and tell me not to worry. Then came the lights. I would count my 37, turn my back, and from the corner of my eye, I'd see a flicker, a temporary 38th, gone when I looked directly. It happened for a week. I followed the protocol. I spent a lot of time at the third sink in the washroom, the cold water losing all meaning against my skin. The breaking point, if I can call it that, was the day I saw myself. I was finishing up in Sector 12, a deep storage area with rows of containers stacked to the ceiling. I was logging the last one when I saw a figure at the far end of the aisle, about 50 meters away. It was wearing my uniform. It had my build, my hair. It was me, but it was just standing there, facing me. Its posture was wrong, too straight, too still. The rule for something like this wasn't on the laminated sheet. It was in a deeper, unspoken set of guidelines you learn through instinct. Do not engage, do not acknowledge, finish your task, and leave. But I was frozen. I stared at this other me. And then it raised an arm, not in a wave, but a slow, deliberate pointing. It pointed past me, to the wall behind me. I didn't want to turn. I had to turn. Against every screaming nerve in my body, I turned my head. The wall was just a wall. When I looked back, the figure was gone. But on the floor, where it had stood, was a small dark puddle, like oil or old coffee, and leading from it were a set of damp footprints. They didn't lead away down the aisle. They led directly to the wall, and stopped. That night, in my bunk in the surface-level dormitory, I decided I had to know. The curiosity was a cancer, eating away at the fear. I had access, not to the interesting things, but to the archives, to the old, forgotten paperwork that hadn't been digitized. The next day, I used a loophole in my logging duties to pull the physical manifest logs from the year. The bunker was expanded. The deeper levels were added. I was looking for anomalies, for patterns, buried in dry logistics reports about concrete volumes and rebar shipments. I found it. A series of work orders for the installation of specialized containment fixtures in Sub-Level 9. A place I didn't even have clearance to know existed. The fixtures were listed by codes, but one had a handwritten note in the margin. A note that must have been missed in a declassification review. It said, in a messy cursive, anchor points for the silent core. The silent core, the phrase stuck in my head. It rang in my ears during the quiet moments. I started noticing other things, patterns in the rules. Many of them were about perception, about counting, about reporting discrepancies. It was a system designed to monitor not the things in the boxes, but our perception of reality itself. We were canaries in a coal mine, and the rules were there to see if the canary was still singing the right tune. The thought made me feel ill. I was a sensor, a living alarm system for a reality I didn't understand. My final shift began like any other. Count the lights, 37, get my cart, move to the deep retrieval zone. The air felt different, charged, like before a thunderstorm. But down here, there is no weather, only recycled air. The first oddity was the door to the retrieval bay. It was cold to the touch, freezing cold, burning cold. I followed the Ager door protocol. My voice a reedy whisper in the thick air. I heard nothing in response. I pushed it open with my foot. The room inside was dark. The motion sensors had failed. The only light came from the emergency strips, casting everything in that sickly green. My container was there, on a pallet in the center of the room. Its serial number was one I didn't recognize, all zeros and a terminal 7. As I approached, I realized the container was humming, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. Rule 4 states that any container emitting audible sound is to be left in place and reported as a Priority 1 anomaly. I reached for my radio. It was dead. Not staticky, just dead. The little power light was dark. I turned to leave, to go get help. And the door was gone. Not closed, gone. In its place was a smooth, unbroken concrete wall. Still cold to the touch, the panic was immediate and total. A white noise in my head. I was trapped. I fumbled for the wall-mounted emergency phone. I lifted the receiver, and instead of a dialed tone, I heard the sound of breathing, slow, wet, and rhythmic. Coming from the earpiece, I dropped it. The container's humming grew louder. It shifted from a single tone to a chord, a dissonant, mournful sound that made my eyes water. And then the lid of the container unlocked, not with a pop, but with a slow hydraulic hiss. It began to open on its own. I backed away until I hit the wall. There was nowhere to go. The lid opened fully, and from within the container, a light spilled out. But it wasn't a light that illuminated. It was a light that consumed. It made the green emergency strips look dim and fake. It was a color I have no name for, a color that hurt to see, and in that light, I saw them, shapes, not bodies, not creatures, but ideas of forms, shifting, flowing into one another. They were silent, but the humming was coming from them, vibrating from their very presence. It wasn't a sound in the air. It was a sound in my bones, in my mind, and with it came the thoughts. Not my thoughts, foreign thoughts. They poured into my head like water into a sinking ship. They were cold, ancient, and infinitely curious. They weren't words. They were concepts, images, a memory of a star dying not in an explosion, but in a slow, endless sigh, a feeling of being buried under mountains for millennia, a perspective of looking at humanity not as individuals, but as a single flickering organism, brief and frantic, and I understood. This was the silent choir. They weren't singing, they were just being, and their existence warped reality around them like a gravity well. The rules weren't containment, they were insulation, buffers to stop our fragile minds from perceiving the bends in reality their presence created. The ager door, the extra shadow, the wrong face on a coworker, those were leaks, tiny fractures in the insulation, and I was now standing in the heart of the fracture. The pressure of their attention was immense. I felt my own mind bending, my memories unraveling. I saw my childhood home from an angle above the roof. I felt the sensation of the laminated rule sheet dissolving in my stomach again. It was all happening at once, past and present, real and unreal. I think I was screaming, but I couldn't hear myself over the silent hum of the choir. I don't know how long it lasted, an instant or a lifetime, but the pressure suddenly lessened. The light receded back into the container, not because the lid closed, but because it was drawn back in. I heard a new sound, a mechanical shriek of metal on metal. From above, a section of the ceiling arised open, and a thick, telescoping arm descended, ending in a complex claw mechanism. It moved with brutal efficiency. It slammed shut around the open container, crushing the metal, and a high-pitched whine filled the room. A noise that actively fought against the dying hum. The claw retracted, hauling the damaged container up into the darkness. The ceiling sealed, and the room was plunged into near darkness, just the green strips again. The door was back, and standing in it were three figures in full environmental suits, their faceplates mirrored. They didn't speak. One pointed at me, another injected something into my neck. The world went gray, then black. I woke up in the infirmary on the surface, a bland, white room. A doctor with a kind face and empty eyes told me I had suffered a seizure due to a previously undiagnosed neurological condition triggered by low oxygen in a malfunctioning sector. They were putting me on administrative leave with full pay pending a review. They were very sorry. My service was appreciated. I knew the script. I played my part. I nodded weakly, asked no questions. They gave me a pill to help me sleep. I pretended to swallow it. When the nurse left, I spat it into my hand. 2 days later, I was on a bus headed anywhere, leaving the desert and its buried secrets behind. I took nothing with me. I left my money in the account, my belongings in the dorm. I just walked out with the clothes on my back and the thoughts in my head. But the thoughts aren't all mine anymore. Sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can still feel the hum, not in the air, but in the foundation of things. When I look at a crowd, I sometimes see a flicker, a face that doesn't quite resolve, and I have to look away. I count things constantly, instinctively, the tiles on a ceiling, the slats in a fence. I can't stop. The rules are still with me, only now I have to write them myself. New rules for a world I'm no longer sure it is the real one. Rule 1. Avoid deep basements and sublevels. Rule 2. If your reflection moves a second after you do, break the mirror. Rule 3. When the world goes perfectly silent, even the insects, hold your breath and wait for the sound of dragging. I live by these new rules. I move from town to town. I work cash jobs. I stay away from anything official. They're probably looking for me, not to silence me, but to check on their sensor to see if the canary is still singing, or if its song has changed into something else. Something that heard the silent choir and understood a fraction of its tune. I know the truth now. The thing we were guarding down, there wasn't a secret. It was a truth so large and terrible that our reality can only bear its weight if it's buried deep and wrapped in layers of rules and madness. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I miss the certainty of counting to 37. I miss the simple, clean fear of a protocol. Because out here, the rules are unwritten, the doors are all ajar, and the silence is never just silence.